Recording. Okay, so I want to start off by acknowledging that my family is from Treaty 2 territory, the Métis community of St. Madeleine, Manitoba, and I'm grateful to be here with you all today from Winnipeg, where I'm currently located on Treaty 1 territory, the original lands of the Anishinaabe, the Inuit, Oji-Cree, Dakota, Dene, and Métis nations. And the water that sustains us here is from Shoal Lake. As somebody who identifies as Indigenous, and more specifically Métis, I dedicate myself to sharing my knowledge and continuing to listen and learn about the many Indigenous nations, their traditions, histories, and ways of life, and to continue to uplift members of our community and to ensure the continuation of our cultures, history, and knowledge for generations to come. And the way that I plan on doing this specifically is through the revitalization of the Michif language, which I'm working on today. So now, as we're all coming together from a virtual setting, I recommend that you take a moment to recognize the Indigenous nations whose original lands you're currently situated on. While doing this, I also encourage you all to take a moment to think about your roles, professional, personal, and academic, that you play in reconciliation and the actions that you are taking or that you may plan to take to ensure that you are active in contributing to improving relationships between Canada and the many Indigenous nations. So to begin our presentation, I'll give a bit of an introduction. So today we have an amazing guest speaker. We have Dr. Niigaan Sinclair, who will be joining us today to talk about the creation of the Native Studies Department and the issues today relating to the strike and Indigenous recruitment. Dr. Niigaan Sinclair has been with the Department of Native Studies since 2012 and has been researching a variety of topics, including Indigenous literature, graphic novels, and masculinities. He is a regular commentator on CBC, CTV, APTN, all regarding Indigenous issues that are pertinent to Indigenous peoples, and recently testified at the Clean Environment Commission of Manitoba hearings on the kiosk generating station and the Bipole 3 transmission line. An activist as well as a writer, he has helped organize the I Don't Know More Winnipeg events and has co-edited 3 award-winning collections, centering Anishinaabe studies, Understanding the World Through Stories, Manitowoc Aboriginal writings from the land and water, and The Winter We Danced, Voices of the Past, the Past, the Future, and the I Don't Know More movement. With that, I'll hand it off to you, Niigaan, to begin.
Okay, so miigwech Chloe for having me, being such a wonderful introducer, and then also for being a part of this. I'm assuming I'm supposed to pin myself, right? Is that what I was supposed to do? Okay, perfect. And so, bonjour everybody, bonjour Ndewe Magadaduk, Niigaanwewidam, Didishnakas, Namagoshin Dodem, Nimenwendam Omayayin. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be with you, of course, on Treaty 1 territory, homeland of my family, my relatives, and then, of course, all the wonderful other relations that we have in this place. The Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Oji-Cree, the Dene, Dene and Inuit who are come and passed through and visited in our areas here. The Lakota, Dakota, Nakota, and of course, we are in the Métis Nation, and so we want to recognize all of our relatives here. I want to talk to you a little bit today about the strike that is taking place right now. Nobody. I think I hear my daughter coming in, so she might wave it as well. So, nobody prepares for a strike. Strikes are not fun for anybody, and they are some of the most traumatic experiences probably that you're going to have as a student. And so I want you to know that many of us are doing this work, coming and spending time on podcasts and talking, and many of us are still supporting our students in lots of different ways. But the most important way that we are trying to support you is to try to maintain the integrity of the university. It's previous long history of excellence in lots of areas, including Indigenous studies. And then, of course, to try to build a pathway, which is what we as Indigenous peoples do for those to enter. The most important thing for us as Indigenous peoples is to try to create a space so that others can walk in our footsteps. We actually have a song about that in the lodge. It said that it's our responsibility to create footsteps so that those who know where to go to find the medicines, to be able to find a good sustainable path of life, for us to be able to leave a little bit of food behind. We actually have teachings around that, around leaving food in the caches for those hunters, those trappers who come after us. And that's what we're doing with this strike. We're trying to build a better world so that those who come after you, the students, the faculty members, community members who interact with the university can have a better path. And that's what this is all about. And I want us all just to think of our relatives right now who are staging a sit-in, literally putting their bodies on the line to be able to, for these principles, to be able to advocate for these principles. Right now, we have our relatives who are staging a sit-in right now in Heather Stephenson's office. And it will be something that will be a big moment, I think, in which for many of us, much of our strikes in the past have been very much located on campus, and now in the future, our relatives will be, going out into the community and talking to this new premier. And I think this new premier, if the hope that this party has instilled in her has been one in that there will be a new direction, it is my hope that this premier will listen to those who are most advocated or most impacted by this strike, which is the students, which is you. And I really appreciate that you spent a little bit of time today thinking about the strike and talking to those of us who are out there on the picket lines, and then also, of course, trying to bring information to you as well. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the history of Indigenous studies at the university so that you can understand why is it the past two strikes, this strike and the past 2016, going back to 2001, and then all the strikes that have happened along the way, but particularly now, why is Indigenous studies so involved with these issues? If you remember back to 2016, we as Indigenous faculty, not all, but the majority of Indigenous faculty came out very vocally the last strike. And we did a collective video. We were on social media. Most of us were in the newspaper. I wrote op-ed pieces to talk a little bit about what was happening at the University of Manitoba. Now, since the 1970s, we've had a Native Studies program, now called Indigenous Studies, soon to be starting next year. But our Native Studies program has been born out of resistance. And what I mean by that is, the very first classes were offered in 1972 by Ovid McCurdy with a professor named Skip Coolidge, who I believe was in anthropology. And what they offered for 2 years was free classes. There was so much demand at that point. 1972, there was, if you remember, Pierre Trudeau's white paper was proposed. Many advocacy and activism was happening throughout the country. And what happened was that Ovid McCurdy came to offer free classes with many other people who were interacting with the university at that time. And one of them was a young student from the University of Winnipeg named Murray Sinclair, who got to see and witness those free classes way back in 1972, 1973. And then eventually there was such a ground swelling of support amongst students, because what happened is that in 1974, there was a racist incident on campus with the engineering faculty. So what happened was that the engineering students used to do this thing called a pub crawl, and they traveled throughout the downtown Winnipeg area. And they had a photographer with them from the Manitoban, the local student newspaper, as we all know what that is. And what they were doing during that night was not only having a general kind of drinking fest with many different things that were happening, but they were taking very inappropriate pictures of Indigenous peoples, many of whom were in very difficult states of being, much like we can see today for our relatives who are downtown. I walked the Mama Bear Clan, and so I know intimately what that looks like. And so the engineering faculty did this pub crawl, which resulted in a kind of massive instance of racism on campus, where they were inappropriately, it was kind of like these students coming from all these other parts of Winnipeg, quite well off, going to the downtown area, and then basically making fun of Indigenous peoples who are in very dire situations and very difficult situations. And what happened was that the small amount of Indigenous students on campus, in collaboration with this groundswell of support from the free classes being offered by Skip Coolidge and Ovid McCurdy, staged a sit-in in the Faculty of Engineering, which resulted in the university refusing to acknowledge, but then participate, but eventually acquiescing and promising that a Native Studies program would be created on this campus. And so in 1974, the very first hire for that program was a person by the name of Raoul McKay. Raoul McKay was our first department head. And then the second hire was a woman named Emma LaRocque. And she was hired as a lecturer in 1974, who was just beginning her work as a master's student in Alberta and wanted to come home, wanted to work in Manitoba. And so Soon after that, a number of other hires came along the way. But soon in the 1970s, what was happening was that the Native Studies program started to become one of the most active politically on campus. And like you can imagine in the late 1970s, at that point, much racism in society, the same kind of racism that birthed the program. The Native Studies faculty was very heavily involved with talking out and speaking out on racism. And in 1983, absolutely uncoincidentally, at the time in which there is this rise of constitutional negotiations and that Indigenous peoples are demanding to be part of the Constitution, the exact same year, that will eventually result in Section 35 of the Constitution, the protection of Aboriginal and treaty rights, that the University of Manitoba eliminates the Native Studies program. And I just want you to think about that for just a minute. They actually erased it from the map. And they said, no more Native Studies program. We don't need that anymore. We're past all of that. Racism is over. And Emma LaRocque, who at that point was very junior faculty, she was untenured, meaning she had no protections. She got a groundswell of students to get together exactly like we did to birth the program way back in 1974. And that there was a letter writing campaign, there was marches, there was a huge amount of outcry amongst the students, and the program was saved in 1983. And here we are now 30 years later, and we are about to celebrate our 50th anniversary as a department. We are the second oldest program in the country, but I want you to think about all of what the first decade of our program. From the first decade of our program, we started from teaching for free. Second is we were birthed out of resistance and racism, meaning the resistance to that racism. We were birthed out of that moment. And then the third is that when we began to be a part of the university, there was an attempt to eliminate us. And that's how easy it is to influence, to control academics. And while I would say that it's much more difficult now to try to erase a Native Studies program, to try to somehow control it or undermine it, if you know with the issues of the 2016 strike, we know that Indigenous studies is constantly under attack because we are the ones who understand perhaps most about what resistance can create. That resistance can create a revolution. And so here we are today, almost 50 years old program, and we are still in the stage of what we faced in 2016. If you remember back to 2016, the Indigenous faculty got together, we created a collective video, we created a number of pieces, and all of those things said that the university was not dedicating itself to the process of indigenization or decolonizing the university, whatever we want to call it. What has been created since that time, since the instances of us stepping up, putting our necks on the line? And for those of us who did speak out, we were in various different ways told, punished, not suddenly in the run for Canada Research Chairs because of our speaking out in the 2016 strike. And so this is a real issue. This is a real issue that when we come out and we speak about the challenges of Indigenous studies, we're really talking about the university trying to control, to influence, to undermine many of the most resistant forces on campus for and the protections that you need in order to go forward and be the most competent and employable person in the future. Because the fact is this, every single one of you will work with, live beside, sit on a bus beside, be married to an Indigenous person in the future. Right now, 20% of Manitoba, Indigenous. Self-declared, many of those. So we're there is some questions about whether that 20% is absolutely accurate, but it's certainly up where it's got a problem. It's definitely 18% or more. If we add up the First Nations, the recognized Métis, undoubtedly there's 20%. But then if I also shook many of your family trees, I would find an Indigenous ancestor in those trees. That doesn't make you Indigenous, by the way, but that does make you have a deep and important relationship with Indigenous communities and gives you an opportunity to perhaps investigate that as a part of your life. And if you get lucky, pretty soon, a community may call you their own. They may call you nephew, they may call you niece. And then in many ways, you can begin to investigate that part of your life. What I'm trying to tell you is that 20% of Manitoba is Indigenous. We make up on the prairies, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Northwestern Ontario, almost 20 to 25% in areas like Kenora, in certain cities. So we are the largest proportional Indigenous community here in Winnipeg. And what does that mean? That means that all of you for one way or another, will work with an Indigenous person, because we are also the fastest growing population in the country. 42.5% in 10 years, according to the Canadian Census from 2006 to 2016. And by all accounts, 2026, when the census comes out again, we're probably going to be even higher than that. What does that mean? That means that our entire generation is going 1.5 times. So if we had, if we had 2 million or 1 million people, we're now at 1.6 million people in Canada. We're now going to be closer to 2.4 million people. What I'm trying to say is that Indigenous peoples are a part of your life. We also are the inventors of all the things that you know of as Canadian, from democracy to the social welfare system, to the very names you see on the streets, on your driver's license. You are fundamentally created by Indigenous contributions. So therefore, it is your responsibility and it is your reality that Indigenous peoples are a part of your life. And part of our advocacy as a department has been to advocate for what many universities are doing now, particularly in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Northwestern Ontario, which is for a mandatory 3 credit hours in Indigenous studies, because the fact is that you're not getting that training most often in your secondary work, in your high school work. And so it's your responsibility to be an employable citizen to be able to get that kind of support. The challenge to that is that those of us that are teaching those courses, those of us that are doing that work, have more stress put on us than anyone else on university, in any faculty in the university. We are required as Indigenous faculty to do more service, to teach more students that perhaps haven't chosen our classes, and then to also be able to do our own research at the same time and be assessed by like everyone else is on the same criteria. Oh, and by the way, Indigenous research is not the same as everybody else. So oftentimes our research is said, oh, well, that's just visiting, or that's just that community seeking to do this other thing over here, or that's not real research, that's not scientific, that's not objective. So whatever ways in which we have many stresses as Indigenous faculty, more demands put on us than anyone else, where oftentimes our service, for example, isn't just going out there and representing a committee or working in a community agency, but we're also expected to teach as service, which is to teach all of our faculty members, our colleagues, to also be able to be on every committee on the university, because the university wants Indigenous input on all these different committees. So what I'm trying to tell you is that recruitment and retention for us is the lifeblood of our department. We need more faculty. We need more faculty that's energetic and committed to our department. And therefore, it's extremely difficult to be able to recruit. And on top of that, the issues involving this strike in 2021. Now, the 4 issues of this strike are quite simple. The first is salary, and it has to do with the mandate by the provincial government, which has said that no public sector employees will get any pay increases. Now, the university has somehow magically come up with a number of 1.5%, a 2-year offer. They absolutely lied to everybody to say it was 9%, because 6.5% of that was already existing increments. So the fact that on day one, within minutes of us going on strike, that there was propaganda being perpetrated, perpetuated by the university is just absolutely inane. It took us weeks last year to get to a rancorous environment, but the university clearly from the first moment was rancorous from the beginning and beginning to lie to the public about what their offer really was. And so this issue is about first salary, and it goes back to the 2016 strike when Brian Pallister told the university to lie to us and to say that that they couldn't offer us money, and then put money on the table and fool around till put us on strike for absolutely no reason. And then what we ended up getting is a very small amount of protections from that 2016 strike. So the issue of salaries going back to the 2016 strike. The second issue that we have is the issue of working conditions, right? So the idea that we have certain protections, certain supports in order to enable our working conditions. And there's a whole litany of things. You can read up on what those things look like. Most of them involve some of similar issues from 2016, the immense amount of work that we have to do outside of our existing research, teaching, and service. But for our Indigenous faculty, we have, like I said before, many demands and many working conditions that are of challenge to us going forward, which leads to number 3. And number 3 was involving the controls of the university in relation to Bill C-33. And the fact is that we need academic protections from the influence of governments, which leads to the 4th issue, which is the issue of bargaining. fair bargaining, having not a province that involves themselves in the control of university education, and for universities to be independent to the government itself. With Bill C-33, Bill 33. Bill 33 is the attempt by the government to control the enrollments of universities, to pin funding according to enrollments so that certain programs will get more funding than others. That is a bill that goes against every single academic freedom that the university is built upon. And this is the challenge that we have to face with this strike. And Indigenous studies are at the center of that. Why? Because we've been cut before. We've been put in a position of having to do more work, more challenges than anyone else. And then on top of that, we also have a massive issue involving recruitment and retention, because it is very difficult, first off, to attract a scholar to Manitoba. On top of that, why? Because we have more demands. We have the Indigenous credit requirement. We tell our faculty members, you're going to have to teach students who are forced to be there. You're going to have to teach students who are, for one reason or another, higher amounts of classes because they're required to go into medicine or go into law or whatever it might be, or to just have a degree within the Faculty of Arts. And then third is, of course, the ongoing challenges. You got to be able to do all the other things that professors are required to do. Oh, by the way, your research may be told is it's not real research anyways. So good luck trying to get a Canada Research Chair. So it's already hard on top of that. Never mind on top of it, which is the salary issues. So what I've done for this teach-in is I've invited one of my colleagues, who is one of our brand new faculty members in our department, to come and join with me a conversation about what it's like to be a brand new faculty at the University of Manitoba. I, of course, have been here for 10 years and I grew up here as well. But I'm going to invite my colleague in here if he's ready. Are you ready? Oh, there he is right there. So this is David Parent, Dr. Parent, who is a wonderful new colleague and a faculty member in the Department of Native Studies, soon to be Indigenous Studies. And so what I thought we'd do is, David, is we talk just very briefly about what it's like for you as a new faculty member in our department. And then what is it like to, experience this issue around salary and then recruitment. But maybe I'll just ask first off, how are you doing? You're brand new to our university, about a year in, and now you're on strike.
Yeah, so I'm doing okay. I had the flu, so I'm still recovering. But yeah, it's been quite the year of kind of starting during COVID, not getting to be with folks, and even from a distance, one of the things that has become clear is how overburdened Indigenous, especially faculty, are at this university. Where we end up having other, fellow colleagues who have to take on way too much, and then as a result don't get the time to do the research that actually allows us to be in our communities and working with our relatives. And often what it can look like is a calendar full of meetings, but no time for research. And that becomes really hard. But what becomes even harder is trying to prep classes, but having to be in meetings, right? So there's those sort of obligations. For instance, when we talk to other colleagues about applying, obviously one of the questions that's brought up is, what about salary? And often when salary becomes discussed, and having many graduate school friends out applying for jobs, I can tell you that a U of T professor, for instance, and I know it's Toronto, lots of resources, but they're making upwards of 30 grand more than, say, someone who's in Manitoba. And, I love living in Manitoba. My grandmother was born in the Interlake. That's why I live here, because of my relationship with her and our family in Transcona. But not everyone's going to come here because they have those attachments, or if they don't have those attachments, what brings people here? And often what brings people to universities are communities of scholars to think with and fair compensation. And that is, not everyone is willing to come just for the family part. I'm a bit of a weirdo that way, maybe, or maybe I'm just Métis. I don't know, but
well, the fact is that we have great difficulty recruiting for Manitoba generally, and the main problem is the winter. Most people kind of have this idea of Winnipeg about the winter. But then the second has really been the working conditions at the University of Manitoba, because when people come, they realize something very quickly. Because we have the Indigenous credit requirement, they're going to have to teach much bigger classes than anywhere else they're going to have to teach in the country. Second is because of that, the demands and the indigenization process of the university, which we frankly is much better than it was in 2016. It's come a long way, but that's resulted in an overwhelming amount of demands for all of us. So new faculty members, we almost have to break it down to them early and say, you're going to be on more committees than almost any of your other colleagues coming out of a PhD program. And then third is the amount of pay that you're going to have to take is the smallest out of all the U15 universities, or the second last anyways.
Right. Yes, and that is a hard thing. But, one of the things I think that we can also speak about is, as you've already talked about, the resistance of Native studies, and not only Native scholars, but Native people in Manitoba have been nickeled and dimed since the Selkirk settlers came, right? The original issues between Cuthbert Grant and the HBC came down to the HBC not wanting to pay Cuthbert Grant enough for his pemmican, or other Métis fair prices for their pemmican, right? Alexander Isbister, who was an early advocate for Métis rights throughout the 1840s through the 60s. Again, he was petitioning constantly to break up the HBC trade monopoly, and to ensure that Métis people would have adequate compensation for their rights. Now, the interesting link with Alexander Isbister is, of course, that's where our offices are, and it's the building is named after him. But one of the things that maybe I wanted to talk about was Alexander Isbister also provided a massive donation that helped the university in its very early days survive. And so the University of Manitoba in part exists because of Métis contributions, right? It also exists because it was set aside lands as part of the Dominion Lands Survey in 1872. But as a result, it does have an obligation to be to I think have Indigenous people in the university, which it does, but we need to be fairly compensated. And Isbister, for instance, when he made this donation, said he didn't want anyone to be discriminated against because, and if you look at his life, so much of his political motivations were a result of him being racialized within the HBC, right? So racism goes very far back in these institutions, and it's not that we can't change how racism works in institutions. We indeed can, but the way we actually do see this happening is really how institutions outside of Manitoba, for instance, in Toronto, or more historically Alberta, because they've really sunk, their economy sunk, but these richer institutions with all of these resources can come, riding up along, slipping into our emails and saying, hey, you want a job? And, that's, we're constantly being inundated by these sorts of requests. And I think, what we're talking about is fair compensation.
Oh, Hunter, I was just going to jump in to say that, I've been at this thing longer than you. I've been here for 10 years, and I've gotten, I think, 9 job offers over those 10 years. And I can tell you that the only reason that I am here is A, my family is here, and B, is I truly love Manitoba. It's a place, like we've both said, you often use the phrase, it's the native Wakanda. Like it's kind of it's the
That was
phrase.
Leonard Monkman. That was Leonard Monkman.
Oh, sorry, that was Leonard Monkman. Okay, well, Leonard Monkman gets the credit for that. But I
That's
will
a
just,
good one, though.
I think it's it's a good way to think about it, especially if you're a comic book fan. But because what's happening in Manitoba is remarkable. Like, and I'll give you an example. Name me a time in Canadian political history where a premier or a leader of any, I don't care, municipality, prime minister, was removed because of racist and incorrect comments that divided Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. Name me a time in history. Brian Palliser's the first, and it happens in Manitoba. It does not because of the bungling of the pandemic, it's not because of the closure of ERs, even though he should be removed for those things. But he was removed from his own party because of his comments around Indigenous peoples, and frankly, just flagrantly incorrect. And I've invited him, of course, to take a Native Studies class, which got me in a lot of trouble a couple of years ago with our department. But I will say what's happening in Manitoba is remarkable. So to be a part of it's very exciting. But the fact is that you could be run into the ground. You could be just run into the ground to continue to do this work and help the university all day. And certainly in 2016, I was not happy and upset about the ways we were being used by the university to get all this funding, to get all this attention, to get all this accolades. And the Native Studies program was almost dead in those days. We were down to like 3.5 faculty. I was barely keeping the lights on by myself, running both the graduate program and the undergraduate program all at the same time. Me and basically my admin staff, who all went on sick leave after the strike. And our department went almost to kaputski. And then boom, here we are now. We're much healthier, 8.5 faculty now, and various different ways that we're a lot more in a healthier position, but we can't keep people. Over the past 4 years, every junior faculty member has left, except for our most recent crop who have been here for under 2 years. And I know for a fact, and we won't say who it was, but amongst you 4 new faculty, you've gotten job offers from other universities. And you've stayed in large part for the same reasons I do. The things that Manitoba offers, the collegiality in our department. But the fact is, if you continue to be treated this way, why would you stay?
Yeah, and I think I'll just be frank. Like racism is still an issue. I have been the target of white supremacist attacks at this university, and at some point, there are conversations that you have with yourself. Is this worth my health? And thankfully I did have support from many colleagues, from my dean. But at the end of the day, the sort of issue of not being able to talk about really when we talk about issues of racism, what we're talking about is issues of whiteness, but we don't want to talk about that. And that's what I think made a book like this, Defeathered an Indian by Emma LaRocque, 1975, so important. Native Studies has a long intellectual tradition, and that intellectual tradition is steeped here in Manitoba in part. And what has made Native Studies such a great place to think is that it's about us as Native people thinking about this world that we're living in. And yes, we can talk, like there are cultural traditions and all of that, but it's also, what do we think of how Canadian society is working and how, say, universities are treating us? We have, as Indigenous scholars, we know how institutions work on us and the impacts that they have, and that's why we have to ask universities to be better. And I think that we're moving in that direction, but we also need more Indigenous scholars at this university, because that is one of the things, for instance, that we see at many universities, this university included, is that as indigenization takes hold, the upper administrative apparatus grows. And rightfully, they generally populate that apparatus with senior scholars and Indigenous scholars. Again, rightfully so. So we have brilliant minds in the administration doing great work for us. But one of the struggles has been replacing those people to do the brick and mortar work of being in the classroom, connecting with students. And I think that's, that's one of the, and that's where it comes back to the way to salary issues and to retention, right? So we might be able to have this,
Well, like I all the stuff you're talking about is stuff that we've been saying as a department for years and years and years and years.
Yeah.
And a good reminder for people is that we can then get labeled as a problem because we say things like, oh, we need more Indigenous faculty, we need more resources. Why are we doing 4 times the work as faculty as everybody else? And so it's worth students hearing that, because we get labeled by administration as being complainers or not appreciative or whatever, and then we suddenly are no longer in the line for Canada Research Chairs and so on. But at the same time, we can begin with a fair deal. Like, this strike is about just fairness, like just trying to treat faculty fairly and not having a political wing, a political party, because I can tell you that we're not talking about a Manitoba government here. We're actually talking about one political party who has a particular idea about how universities should be controlled, and therefore that party has said this is how the university will be controlled financially, how will control their enrollment, and therefore control the academics. And this is what this strike is really all about. So just fairness and getting out of bargaining, treating the university as the academic independent entity that it is, because we know that when independence is compromised at a university, Native studies programs are cut. They're controlled, they're undermined. We know that. Why? Because we are the ones saying to premiers, hey, you should take a Native studies class. We are the ones saying it's not appropriate for you, Mr. Premier, Mr. Minister, to say inappropriate, racist things, wrong things about residential schools. Hey there, maybe we should have a statue of Indigenous peoples or First Nations at the Manitoba legislature. We are the ones doing that. And on top of all the other things that we do, talk about stolen land, talk about how do we co-govern, how do we create a future for this country that's equitable and that's actually reflects the communities in which we serve. And you said before, people always ask me, like, they'll say, when do we get to a point where we can have reconciliation? And I've said, a good example would be when we see in every profession in Manitoba a reflection of the communities in which they serve. So what does that mean? If we had 20% Indigenous faculty at the University of Manitoba, we can begin to talk about reconciliation. If we took all the faculty members, there's 1,200 of them in SSUMFA, that means 20% of that, that's 240, I think, right? Is my math terrible there? They didn't hire me to do math. I'll just leave it. But 20% of 1,200, that would be where we'd beginning to talk about a reconciliation. And we aren't even close to that. Last numbers I know is maybe 40 Indigenous faculty in that neighborhood. Yes, thank you, Myrna. Myrna helped me with my math. I was right, 240. There you go. Can you just talk briefly before we open it up to some questions? So Chloe, I want you to, Chloe's going to handle any questions or comments that people want to have for the last 15 minutes or so. But can you just talk about it briefly about like the issue of recruitment, or perhaps the issue of what the university can offer to new faculty, or perhaps what other universities are offering to other faculty members that you know of that are coming out of university, and how they're just not even competitive. I know that we lost one faculty member because we just weren't even a competitive offer to this person who took a job at another university. Like, we weren't even in the ballpark.
Right. So, maybe I should, I think there's precedent for how to increase Indigenous faculty members at a university. For instance, when I started my master's at the University of Alberta, in the Faculty of Native Studies, I think the faculty might have been around, maybe 8 or so. But in the time that I was there, the faculty more than doubled. And it was because at the time we had this sort of perfect storm of first of all, the TRC, and then we had a Liberal government, majority government, and then we also had an NDP government come into power in Alberta. And what we saw was tons of hiring and the growth of the faculty. Um, and so there is precedent for that, and we're now seeing this in Toronto and at the various different schools in Toronto of all these cluster hires for Indigenous faculty. Now, it's good, of course, to have Indigenous faculty across the university, but Native Studies departments in particular are quite important because we can also be a place where we don't question necessarily the grounds, for instance, of Indigenous sovereignty, right? That is where we start from, and then we go on from there. Like, we don't have to prove Indigenous sovereignty because we already know that, we know that, right? So, and that's the importance of programs like ours and departments like ours. But also, you have to realize when people are talking about, say, free speech, academic freedom, this is core to the university, and why the university is important for Native Studies is we need to have these platforms to have academic freedom to talk about the issues in society that we're dealing with. Now, when it comes to recruitment and retention, what I have seen at other universities, and I'll be honest, I was treated actually very well coming in to be to be both attracted and retained, in terms of I was hired without finishing my PhD, given time to finish, given course releases to finish.
That was selected by faculty, though. Like, that was the committees of faculty that did that. But yeah,
and that's and that sort of advocacy was and absolutely Dr. Carrie Miller, Dr. Chima Chen, these folks who've just who were great advocates. But if they had not have been there, I don't know if I would have necessarily had as good of a time or had as good of a deal coming here, right? So that's sort of where we have to start thinking about, in my opinion, there's no better place in Canada to do Indigenous studies than in Winnipeg. Just full stop. Like, I also do urban Indigenous studies, and you're not going to find a better place to do that. But just because of that doesn't mean that the university should be paying people less. And yet that has sort of been, some of a common argument, of course, is cost of living. As we can see with recent inflation, the cost of living is going through the roof, right? And not just elsewhere, but here in Manitoba as well. So that I guess
0% doesn't match the inflation, and nor does the current offer of the university of 1%. Doesn't even come close to. In fact, the offer that the UMFA made to the university last week wouldn't even match inflation either, and we could have ended the strike and be back to work this week. The one thing I wanted to add to you just about how important Indigenous studies is, if there isn't an Indigenous studies program or department, like other scholars like Warren Carreau and Kira Ladner and others, Indigenous scholars throughout the university, they can do their work better because they have us, because they have a Native Studies Center. It doesn't work the other way. When there are individual scholars across the campus, they're not able to support each other because they're too busy doing work across campus. They never talk much. And we can see that at certain universities like Calgary, where they have a bunch of Indigenous scholars. Some of them are very good, but there's no momentum on that campus for being able to create, because they don't have an Indigenous studies program. They have an international Indigenous studies kind of part-time program that no one is really involved in, and they're all 0.5s or 0.25s. So when there is a strong Indigenous studies program supported, cared about, and made sure that it's a safe place and protected, then other scholars can do their work better. It doesn't work the other way. It doesn't work when you have good scholars over here. There's momentum for Indigenous students and peoples. That doesn't happen. There's no momentum. There's no locus. There's no center.
Yeah, and then also suddenly other people on campus become the experts on what Indigenous studies is. And historically, we know that's been places like anthropology, for instance, where we've not been those studying, but rather those who have been studied. And that's another reason.
Yeah, exactly. Actually, I was in a meeting this morning talking about which universities don't have Indigenous studies programs. And those are also the universities where you see lots of people faking Indigenous identity, lots of people who are exploiting Indigenous communities, being very violent, and surprise, surprise, many people who are in certain departments that have historically exploited Indigenous communities, and therefore those communities will never work with that university. And that's what happens when you don't have an Indigenous studies program. It really is a big part of ethics in university as well.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we should just, as a note, for instance, at this university, throughout the 1950s and 60s, this was a central hub for producing knowledge about Indigenous people in Manitoba for the purposes of the provincial government to then govern those people, right? So a lot of the land loss that we see, especially for Métis communities in the from the 1940s to the 60s, is partially connected to, say, professors in anthropology or community development, agriculture, doing research that then is used by governments to dispossess, right? So that's also why it's so important for Indigenous studies scholars to be in universities, to be studying how universities study us. So.
Yeah, no, absolutely. If you look at any of those reports in the 1970s that were used for all the really draconian decisions on First Nations, like child welfare, like justice, like health, like this ongoing situation involving the cutting down of health in Indigenous communities, which leads to the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, all of those things rolled together. That was from academic work. That's why we need Indigenous studies to be supported. We need a fair deal. We need people who are working in our field to get supported. And this is why it's so important. That's why when I was asked by Chloe and the other students today to come and join with, I'll come to this. Anytime the students ask me, I will be here 100 times. And anyone who knows me knows that every time I've been asked to come to by a student, anytime, any place, I'm there. When it was the Indigenous credit requirement discussions, I was there. When it was the all of the clashes and involving back a couple years ago, I was there, and I continue to be here for students. So we'll bring Chloe back in the discussion here, because I want you to, if there's something you want to ask to faculty members about the strike, or if there's any students who are on this, I'm very happy to answer things. If it has to do with the Indigenous Studies program, happy to answer that. But if it's also something just generally about the strike, then we'd be happy to do that as well. So Chloe, I'll hand it back to you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Niigaan and David, for sharing your thoughts and also some information regarding the Department of Native Studies, soon to be Indigenous Studies, and then also surrounding the strike. One thing that I kind of found really interesting is in regard to, speaking about the bill C-33 and how it's controlling like the funding based on enrollment and stuff, is how can you see a department grow? Because obviously it has to start somewhere, right? So if you don't have the funding in the beginning because you don't have a lot of enrollment because it's a brand new program or a newer program, then how can you see it grow if there's not funding, right? So in the case of Native Studies, like it's still like a growing, obviously it's older, but it's still a growing department, and people are becoming more and more and more interested in it, from what I can see with students. But if you don't have the funding because the enrollment is smaller, how can you expect to see it grow? Because then you can't acquire the
We've
faculty.
struggled a lot with our language program, and because the fact is that we can't get enrollment for two things. One is for a language to be offered in the first place. So we have to do a ton of extra work and promotion and say, hey, we're going to offer Michif, everybody. And I can tell you that the reason that we have Michif is because of the work of the students. It's because the students got together and said it's important. The students fought for it, and they refused to accept that we kept going to the faculty and saying, we want to offer this class, but we don't have the kind of supports. We need to get some supports put into place. And it was the students who created that class. And the second thing is we have real problems with getting upper years support. So because we don't often hit the threshold of enrollment. So what happens is language programs will never produce speakers because they'll never be able to take the second and the third year. And luckily now, because of the demands of our students and also the really hard work of Dr. Carrie Miller. And then I started the work back when I was acting head, the first time around when I was acting head back in 2016, 2017, was we now have an Anishinaabe language teacher who doesn't have a PhD. And that was one of the big hurdles we had to get over, is recognizing the value of Indigenous knowledge. And we got that tiny little door opened for our instructor, Pat Ningwans, or our professor, Pat Ning wants to be able to be a professor at the university. So absolutely, you can see that when you control enrollment or you pin funding to enrollment in a university, guess who's going to lose out? It's probably going to be Native studies, women's and gender studies, people who are breaking new areas, right? People who are having new conversations in society. People aren't ready for those conversations, so they might not be ready for signing up for a class. We need to make sure that we support it. And in this case, we know that those possibilities won't be there because of this bill.
Mhm. Yeah, for sure. And then something else too, just kind of off of what you said there is in regard to, oh shoot, sorry, I actually lost my point. But I will, I have a few other points, but I think I'll pass it over
I posted
to
in the chat, by the way, a column that I wrote about Bill 33. So just in case people want it connected, it's you know.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I saw that in the chat there. And if anybody has any questions too, feel free to put them in the chat as we do have some time right now. Or feel free to raise your hand and you can also just speak out about it if you feel comfortable.
You know, if I might add too, though, to your question and to Niigaan's point, let's not forget universities are across Canada are significantly benefiting from quote unquote indigenization, and therefore are also significantly benefiting from those who are so-called investing in indigenization. So, but there, it's sort of a double-edged sword, because one of the issues that comes up with demand is that we can't offer upper level courses because there's such demand at the lower levels, which means that professors end up teaching an extreme amount of students compared to upper level classes, right? Like Niigaan is, you know, forever been teaching, you know, upwards of 175 to 225 students, right? And this also, you know, this is sort of a point for me, is that I find it, as someone, you know, who came up through university, through community college, and then went to a smaller university, you know, one of my things that I try and reconcile often is how do you reach students at that level, right? And how do we have the supports to be able to do the deeper learning about this place, about the history of this place, and about Indigenous contributions, for instance, when we can't necessarily have discussions. So that's the other thing, is, you know, partially like the size of classrooms becomes an issue because of the lack of faculty. And you can sort of see how there's a ballooning effect, right? And how, you know, if we're only teaching, you know, one section and then getting to teach other things across our discipline or interests, it's a little bit different, because then you get to actually start building those relationships with students, because you have more, you have less, you know, you just have less students to be teaching, right? So
the whole discipline suffers because of these huge classes. And, you know, I've been teaching these huge classes because they're a crucial recruitment tool for us. We never get the students in the upper years classes unless they have a good experience at the first year, which is why I spend so much time teaching in the first year courses. And but, you know, to plop that on, I can tell you that my research has suffered immensely. And then on top of that, when I do research, like, for example, I'll give you one example. So in Native studies, we celebrate when people work together and co-author pieces. But when I go up for tenure, those are considered to be, they don't even consider those. Or when it's considered to be awards or shirks, or when we go in the university and we try to get, you know, awards for our research, we're seen as lesser scholars because we work with people. Because I didn't have single authored studies, which, by the way, nothing was more exploitative than working with an Indigenous community and then putting your name on the cover of the book. It's like the whole field of academics is built against Indigenous knowledge, the ways that and so when we try to fight for that, then we suffer immensely. I can see there's a question as well. So,
Laura, I see you have your hand up if you wanted to unmute your mic and ask your question.
I just had a quick comment to Dr. Parent's comment about class sizes. So I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Native Studies at the University of Manitoba, and I recently accepted a position at the University of Winnipeg in the Faculty of Education because of the things that were very different from the two institutions, one of them being they could offer me more money to teach smaller classes, despite the fact that they are required classes. So my experience at the University of Winnipeg teaching a required class was that I had 35 students in my class, unlike when I taught 220 students in my class, right? And now I'm in the Faculty of Education. They also have a requirement which all education students must take, but the class is capped at 60 people, right? Their response to that is by hiring 5 new faculty this year alone to be able to make up the people that they need in these positions. So it's, luckily for me, I wanted to stay in my home territory. I'm a Métis scholar, and I was able to do that, but at another post-secondary institution that we have here in Winnipeg. So we're even leaching scholars across the river to the University of Winnipeg.
Well, I mean, thanks, Laura, for that. And what I would also point out is that we are the main producer because we are one of the only PhD programs of Indigenous studies in Canada. We are also the only, obviously, PhD program in the province. We are producing literally the field in Manitoba. And so there is an obligation to realize that one of the most important sections is going to be our program. And while that may sound self-invested, it's the reality. And that therefore we need to support one of the most important departments at the University of Manitoba, which is our department, simply because we are building the field itself. Like, there's not many builders of the field across this country. We're the second oldest, and we're constantly fighting with our own university for legitimacy, for fair pay, and we're literally building the field. And so people like Laura are a good example. I mean, coming out of our program is now benefiting, the University of Winnipeg is benefiting from us. And, and it's stressful. It's hard, man. It's hard to keep doing this work over and over and over again to in this situation. Now, I think there's a question from Emily, who's working with Press Progress. Do you want me to just do that question here, Chloe?
Yeah, for sure. If you want to just go ahead and answer that one.
So people can see the question in the chat here. It's the question from and Emily's with Press Progress. I'll just read it out here. Do you feel like Heather Stephenson has an opportunity to take a different path from Pallister by removing the wage mandate and move towards improving recruitment and retention for Indigenous faculty at the University of Manitoba? Okay, so here's what I think, and I'm on leave from the Winnipeg Free Press. I would write this in a column if I wasn't on leave at the moment to be the acting head of our department here. So I would say first off that I get where Premier Stephenson's coming from. She perhaps thinks that she needs to keep this mandate because if she's going to give us salary, she's going to have to give the nurses salary, and then so on down the line. The nurses have been going how many years without a contract? Do we all realize, by the way, that ACES, our administrative staff at the University of Manitoba, have been without a contract for a very long time too? Like people who are doing the real bricks and mortar work, like we think of ourselves very importantly, and rightfully so, we do the teaching, the research, the service. But all those people who organize the classes, who work their butt off, who risk their job security on Friday to come and support us at the demonstration at the admin building, these are people who are constantly under duress, who never get paid adequately, and frankly are under just horrendous working conditions. They're always the ones who have to pick up everything. When they cut the faculty, it falls to the administrative staff. So the ACES, you deserve a contract as much as anybody on this campus. But what I would say is that I understand Heather Stephenson doesn't want to be one of her first acts as breaking the mandate. But the fact is that it's also not Heather Stephenson's fault that Brian Pallister lied or encouraged the university to lie to us. Encouraged the strike to take place, facilitated a needless rancor between administration at the university and the university faculty. Like, it's not her fault either. She can break with this mold. She can show courage. She can do the right thing. And probably the most important of all is that if she cares about the well-being of students, when we had the strike in 2016, I was acting head at that point. I saw more student appeals. I saw more student withdrawals. I saw more students with stress going on stress leave, and that was not even during a pandemic. We have the pandemic on top of that. Students have had the most stressful time, and if we are truly dedicated to students, if Premier Stephenson is dedicated to the well-being of students, she will call an end to the strike, She will do the right thing and rectify this horrendous situation which was created under the time of Brian Pallister and is now 5 years old. The amount of bitterness and rancor that is between administration, and you saw it in the very first press release by the university where there was outright propaganda being spread out about what the deal was being offered to UMFA. And it's just unbelievable that it got that ugly that quickly, but that just shows you the anger coming back to 2016. And if we care about students, Premier Stephenson, do the right thing.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Niigaan, for that. Does anybody else have any questions that they would like to ask?
Yeah, thanks so much, Myrna. Myrna sent me a message about the ACES, so yeah, thank you too, Myrna. I'll say one more thing here, is that it is completely inappropriate to continue to ask people to take 0% cuts. 1% cut, which is so minuscule and embarrassing, when there is $90 million in surplus at the university and administrators who make upwards in hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars, and they have absolutely no problem in making the immense amount of money that they do. And to ask faculty to continue to shoulder the burden and do the lion's share of the work, and to get not any increases, supports for our workload conditions, and for the continued treatment, disrespectful treatment of faculty at this campus, never mind Indigenous faculty, all faculty, but Indigenous faculty in particular, it is absolutely inane, unbelievable. And the fact that we have to go and sit in politicians' offices when we should be teaching students is unbelievable. It's unbelievable, but yet so believable. Sorry, David, I started becoming a little soapboxy there. So you can obviously tell,
No
though.
problem.
I've got a bit of a, I get quite emotional about it because 2016 was so awful, and this one's turning into a similar situation.
Right. See, I was an MA student in 2016. I remember watching from Alberta it happening, and just the the effects that it was having on students. And I think about how much I'd rather be teaching a class right now than doing this. And it's because that's ultimately who's missing out right now is the students. And I really hope that the Premier can provide some clarification if this mandate is still in effect, because according to the president of the university, it is still in effect, but we haven't heard. So some clarification would be really great, so that we would know, who to have a conversation with, because that mandate's already been, defeated in the courts. So.
Well, although the recent court decision has actually upheld some of it. So, but yet in that decision, it was acknowledged that the treatment of UMFA was inappropriate. And so there was a provision in that decision where our situation is different than others, in that we were used as an example then to try to punish the nurses, punish other unions as well. I will say one other thing that I'll just say this and then maybe end off here, Chloe, if that's okay. Incorrect, divisive, and frankly, one-sided, wrongful information being circulated by the university. And I will give the university a bit of credit. As soon as that initial propaganda was released, saying that they were offering us 9.5%. By the way, the faculty would have taken 9.5% if that was what was actually on the table. But 6.75 or whatever it was percent was already existing increments. So it was just a bright lie. It was like absolutely nonsense. And the university did put out statements to say that they had spoken perhaps ambitiously or perhaps not fully, completely, truly. And so I will give the university credit, but who put that press release out in the first place? Who was the person who made that decision to try to, within seconds of going on the picket line, to be able to, try to turn the public against us, turn students against us for outright lies. I don't know who that person was. I actually do know who that person was, but that person should perhaps look in the mirror a bit and realize that you're not helping. In fact, you're putting your university colleagues in dire positions, because it's not easily forgettable when we know somebody who's in administration doing such egregious acts. And I would only say that now that I'm tenured. Because, the fact is that, the fact that, David came on here, kudos to you, and also all of your other faculty members who are in their untenured positions, coming out and being brave and standing on the picket line and standing in solidarity with everybody. There are certain faculty members who have chosen to break the picket lines for whatever reason they've decided to do that. And there's a small amount of them. And, it takes bravery to come out there and step with us and on the principled issues. But they're ultimately doing this so that, as I mentioned when I opened up today, that we leave good footsteps for our relatives to follow, that we build a safe place for Indigenous students, Indigenous faculty, Indigenous communities to come into the university. And that you, Chloe, and all the other wonderful students who are on this call, we're doing this so that you can have a good place to learn, so that all of you can be in a place where you have the best faculty, the best situation, the most chance for success. And like we've done in the past, fighting against to make sure our program continues and be the best it can be, even in the most direst of circumstances, we will continue to do so in the future. That's all we do in the Department of Native Studies / Indigenous Studies.
Thank you so much for that. And I just want to say thank you again, both so much for your time, David and Niigaan, for your presentation today and your talk with us. I know students will all benefit, and we all appreciate very much all the time that you've spent with us today. And also thank you to everybody who attended today to listen to Niigaan and David speak. One final note that I will say is just to make sure that you do follow Students Supporting UMFA on our socials, which will be posted in the chat. And yeah, I hope you all have a great rest of your day, and thanks again so much for attending.
Miigwech, everybody. Take care, and miigwech, David. Eh? I'll talk to you in a bit. Okay, I'll see you on the picket line.
Thank you. Bye.